Es war das Zusammenkommen verbunden mit den Yahrtzeit noch den Taten und mit drüber kam Pomim, was Afal Pi, was Lecheiro, in das Alinien von Aproti. Wie bald aber Bichlal Aziden kleiben sich zusammen, wird es schön Alinien Kloli, ist ätzend Sach, wo das Retzach wegen der Yahrtzeit von Aiden, was hat sich Meiser Nefesh gewähnt, Al-Haklal, und das ist gewähnt, die Derech HaTeva, die Siebe, von sein Nicht-Ariches Yomim, die Vierlach. Der Fall, was mit Zadavidose Bishvil Haklal, hat man früher reingesetzt bei Meister, in Arrest und danach verschickt und dort Gufe gemattert, wo das gewähnt, der Levushim bei Derech HaTeva, was der Vater gewähnt, nicht in Ariches Yomim, wie es hat gedarf sein bei Derech HaTeva. Jetzt auch das Gufe, Madgish, hat das Ayin, was es scheich ist zu Aklau, und befragt noch, aber wie bald das Miset, hat die Peris von seinem Messias Nefesh bei Medina Hahi, einen haben gebracht, Peris und Peris, das heißt bei Pashtus, Iden, wo sie seinen Leben die Teile und Schemere Mitzvah, Bechaye Jem, nicht gucken dich auf dem Matzel, wie sie gewähren dorten, bei schon bis man Hahu und nachher dann noch in die Jahren Liachrise, wo das ist der Chechet Abir, auf der Linie von der Yahrtzeit, wo die Gemorre sagt sich la Haloche, als es beschaße da ein Ziel an die Ziel an der Schomme beguf, das Bedugme von der Sreife, von der Sefer Teiro, wird sich die Scheile sich adover wie Fuche, a Yid mit Magid Dvorev Liankev Chukov und Mishpotev Yisro, was jeder Lostos der Rebesteller soll sein a Sefer Teiro Shenisrefo. Das a Hepech a Halocho, dofun Gufe verstandig hat der Pikuach Nefesh, was wird durch Ruf aufgetan, der Aliyah Achig Delo, was durch Ruf, was wird durch Ruf herauskommen, Ezeche Deche, Afil Azam in Inyan, Achim Avil, wo das bringt noch zu Frauen der Yahrtzeit. Wo das Ezeche Tadbir ve Hezber, Abishas do a Tag von der Yahrtzeit. Allachas kamen von der Gordel bei Yisro. Allachas kamen von der Sami, was hat sich Meiser Nefesh gewähnt. Al-Haklal, und hat angenommen sein Messias Nefesh, bis Messias Nefesh bepeil, kleis an Neshama mehaguf. Das ist nicht mehr Maid, und die Piulese, was getan in Apotzes Ayadus, der Adrabe, wie bald die Piulis, kommt dazu noch zu, der Sipur und der Hero, was mit ihm hat getroffen, bis Seif Yomov, Schlebe Derech HaTeva, als gewähnt der Kiddush Hashem bepeil, Messias Nefesh, Yitzias HaNefesh min Aguf, ist das noch mehr Mechazik, die Piula von seinen Piula ist bepashtus, in Afotzes Ayadus, bei die alle, was gepeil dämmelt, und nechet bei die, was peilt ist, durch seine Sforim, was haben sich auch gedruckt, und wir lernen sie, kommt dazu zu, midi Shono beshono, lernt man sich noch in seine Sforim, kommt zu noch in Piulis, und die Tezois von seinen Piulis, midi Shono beshono.
Welcome to this Farbrengen on the auspicious day of Chof, a day so dear to the Rebbe, and by extension, a day so dear to us and Chassidim. And this day is a day not only of inspiration and strength, but it's a day to focus on the life of the Rebbe's Holy Father and a day that we can not only learn and follow in his ways, but also to affect the goals that he stood for and that he had self-sacrifice for. As we heard from the Rebbe also mentioned how this is the Torah of his father, how it's increasingly learned year by year, and how the Sfarim, how his Torah is printed just by divine providence. A new Sefer of the Rebbe's father's Torah was brought this morning to the oil, both to the Tzion here in New York and to the Tzion of the Rebbe's Holy Father in Alma-Ata. And we see that the day of the 20th of Av, the Yahrtzeit of the Rebbe's Holy Father, is the only day that we have a Farbrengen or mark by the Rebbe with a Sicha throughout the years of the Rebbe's Nesias from Tafshin Yud, from 5710, from 1950. The Rebbe always held a Farbrengen on the Yahrtzeit of his father. There are no other days. I don't know. We're sitting here with great Chassidim, but this has been checked over. This is the only day that the Rebbe always Farbrengen was the Yahrtzeit of Chof. This is just something to illustrate how close, obviously, it is the closest thing to the Rebbe's heart. The Rebbe mentioned his father's Torah, and as we continue, as we learn the Rebbe's Torah, you don't have to have the keenest and sharpest knowledge of Torah to see how the Rebbe's own Torah is patterned and guided and shaped by his father's Torah. And I'd like to introduce those that are sitting, we're Farbrengen here today, Rabbi Shmerling and Rabbi Mintz and Rabbi Taub and Rabbi Dubov. And I'd like to call on Rabbi Dubov to speak a little bit. I must say that Rabbi Dubov is also the one, he's the Mahadir, he's the one who edits and prepares for publication some of the Rebbe's father's Torah, which is quite complex, but he makes it palatable. So thank you so much for joining us today, Rabbi Dubov.
Thank you very much. So first I want to mention that you see very clearly, I'm going to give you an unbelievable mashal, an example that we have of the signun, the style, how the Rebbe would always Farbrengen. So we know mashal Shabbos would come, the Rebbe would come to Farbrengen, and right away he would tie everything together. So the parsha, the day of the week, if it was a Chodesh, if it was a special Yahrtzeit, everything had to be connected by Shgoch Pratis. And the Rebbe would give a bia and weave through all the details to show that's all one Nakud, it's all one point. So it's so interesting that we find this by the Rebbe's father. We find that the letter that the Rebbe's father sent to the Rebbe Fes Chasna, I think it was Vov Kislev and Tov Reish Peites. And it's interesting that Elachaim Altuis, who was then the Rebbe's guard, his shoyma, he writes in his diary that he saw it. The Rebbe didn't hide it. He said there was a lot of Kabbalah over there. So the Rebbe, if you read the letter good, you will see that he ties in 5 things together in that letter. He says like this: your Chassid is going to be number 1 on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Then he says it's going to be on the 14th day of the month, so it has to be a connection to the 14th day. It's Parshas Vayetze. Then it's the month of Kislev. And here he explains 2 pratim. What's the meaning of the name Kislev? And also, Kislev is the 3rd from the beginning of the year, Shlishi Lechadoshim. So all these five details, he goes one by one, and he connects all of it together, and he shows that it's all one Nekudah, that the world, all these details tells us that the main reason of a chasna is that we should bring the world to tikkun, which means to the ultimate redemption of Mashiach Tzedkeinu of Meher V'Yimena Mamash. I just want to say one bracha to all of us, something that the Rebbe's father writes to the Rebbe, and he says, he explains him the bracha that we're now Chof, we prepare ready for the new year, and he writes him a bracha l'shana teva mesukah, and he explains over there, it seems like a double expression, redundant. If it's a good year, then it's probably sweet. If it's sweet, then it's good. What's the toiva and mesukah? But the answer is very simple. We all know that sometimes the Eibishter does good. There's no bad that comes from heaven, but not always do we see it. Where people were limited, we don't see the good. So in our eyes, it looks bad, but really, from Hashem's point of view, it's really good. So that's the bracha he told them. We should have, in his languages, gevura mimutokos. It means all these hidden goods. We don't want that. We want should be mesuka, should be sweet. By us, it should be sweet. L'chaim Shana Tova, ganz Klal Yisrael should be a good, and should be only a sweet year. Kipshutik Mashmoel. Shana Tova mesuka.
Amen. We're now going to continue the Farbrengen with the Chassidic singer Rebbe Avraham Fried, who merited to sing by the Rebbetzin, the Rebbe's mother, and she had much nachas. Rebbe Avraham.
Yashe koyach. Thank you, Rabbi Feller, for the kind words. Thank you. I was Zechus, indeed, as a little boy, to be neighbors with Rebbetzin Chana, Aleha Sholem, the Rebbe's mother. And being a little boy, I don't remember much, but my mother, Aleha Sholem, would tell me that she would sometimes go to visit. We were neighbors next door. And she would say to me, Avraham will sing something. How she knew that I have a inkling or a chush in singing, I don't know. Maybe she heard us singing Zmidis, my family. And I was a little boy, a shy boy, and I would go behind the curtain. And I would sing for her from behind the curtain. What exactly I would sing, I don't remember. I imagine Al-Babachining, this is before Bring the House Down and No Jew Will Be Left Behind. And she one time gave me a 25-cent coin. I was very happy. A little boy, I ran to the nearest toy store and I bought a water gun. I don't have the quarter or the water gun, but that's what I was able to get from the Rebbetzin. And I was told that in the name of Rabbi Weinberg, Olav Hasholim, the well-known Baal Tefillah by the Rebbe, that he was once standing outside of 1418 and talking to the Rebbetzin, and she said to him how much she enjoys listening to the Zmidis of the Friedman family, and especially Avraham, how he sings. And she said something to the effect that she believes, or she benches me, that I will yet have a big zchus to be Mesameach Am Yisrael through singing. So Rabbi said, this is not my koiches, it's not koiche ve'oitzim yodi, this is all the brach of the Rebbetzin Chana, and of course the Idud and the Chizuk had gotten the Rebbe over the years. So that's the whole story in under 2 minutes. So let's say L'chaim, we'll sing a Chassidische Niggun, L'chaim. I imagine that by Nagina also, there's probably an element of Menakala Lakovid. No, we can't just gain gleich to Atzilis, right? So something a little on the lighter side. Gershon, you ready? Ya mama mama ya mama ya mama 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 ay la da 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 la da da ay yo 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 da 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 ya mama mama oh ya mama mama da mama 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 oh ida ya la da 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 mama 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 oh ye la da 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 mama mama ay la da 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 oh ida ya mama mama ay la da da ya mama la da ya mama oh la da da ri la da da ri la da da ya yum ram bam 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 ay la da da la da da ram ya mama na da da rai Hey, ach, dai, 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 dum. Ay, la, da, 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 la, la, da. Ay, 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 la, da, da, ay, la, da, 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 la, da, da, dum. Ay, 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 ay. Do-do-do-do-do-do. Yum-mum-mum-mum. Oh, you die, you die, la da da da. You da ma 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 ma, ah ma 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 ma. Ay die, la da da da, ay la da da da, yum mum mum. Ay la da da, yum mum mum. Di-di-do, ay la da da da, ay la da da da. Ah, ma 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 ma. Tere oi da 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 da. Chaim v'livrocha.
In Tafshim Mem Ches, the Rebbe said, after my father-in-law, the Rebbe, left Russia, the only descendant of the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe, and the Tzemach Tzedek left in Russia was my father. So many people, for that reason, turned to him for guidance. And it was because of his efforts in spreading Yiddishkeit and Chassidus, he was imprisoned, where he later passed away.
During the infamous Beilis blood libel, the prosecutors tried to prove that Chassidim were especially involved in the murder. To refute their claims, numerous committees were established: a committee of lawyers, a committee of doctors, a committee of experts in Talmud, and a committee of experts in Kabbalah. The Rebbe Rashab appointed Rebbe Levi Yitzchak as one of the members of the committee of Kabbalists. He then appointed him as the head of that committee. Under his able guidance, they disproved the accusation from a Kabbalistic standpoint.
In Tishrei Tavshin Nun, Reb David Nachshon Rabbi Avi Taub gave the Rebbe the key to the newly renovated oil of his father. And the Rebbe took the key and asked him, "Is this the key to the oil?" The Rebbe then said, "You are very fortunate. Your reward is great and your merit is tremendous. You have inspired the Russian Jewish community and you have helped fix the oilim of our holy and righteous Rebbeim. May there be no need to do this anymore, as they will soon arise with Tchias HaMesim."
After he was freed from Chile, Rebbe Levi Yitzchak spent the last few months of his life in Almaty. At that time, Almaty was a hub for all types of Jewish refugees fleeing from the Russian front. One day, a fight breaks out between some of the various groups. The argument pained Rebbe Levi Yitzchak greatly. He said, "When there's a famine, we don't look to see if the bread is white or black. As long as there is bread, why are people fighting at a time like this?"
Levitzo once visited Lubavitch and he was asked to give a shiur to the Bachim. He gave a deep shiur that lasted more than an hour and a half. What was the shiur? Why the Alter Rebbe began the 12th chapter of Tanya with the word Ve'habeinunu with Avav and not Habeinunu without Avav?
General, Rabbi Dubov mentioned the Gvuris Memutakis. Whenever we talk about the Rebbe's father's Torah, we always have to remember that what we have of the Rebbe's father's Torah is Ketipa min Hayam. It's a drop in the ocean. Most of his writings, unfortunately, we don't have, and we have a few volumes of that the Rebbe published of the Rebbe's father's writings. These were some are writings that he wrote for himself, and some are correspondence, letters that he had with the Rebbe after the Rebbe left Russia. So they kept a steady correspondence back and forth. But I think that it wouldn't be a mistake to say that the concept of Gvura, Gvuras Memutakis, is a central theme in the Rebbe's father's Torah.
In other words, sweetening severity. In other words, something good coming out of the tough stuff.
And there's a famous Rishima that the Levi Yitzchak wrote about himself and
his birthday.
The Golas, Ani, Levi Yitzchak, Ben Zal de Rachel. And he explains how everything is Gvura. Levi is Gvura, and Yitzchak is Gvura, and everything is Gvura. And throughout his life, he experienced Gvuras, what we would look at as simple Gvuras. But the theme of being Mamtik the Gvuras, that was like a central theme. Bichlal, when we're talking about the Rebbe's father's Torah, I remember when I was young, a young bacher in yeshiva, occasionally I looked up something that was in a sicha or in a maimer, mitzuyin to shtikul Levi Yitzchak, Likut Levi Yitzchak, and open up. It was always scary looking, pages and pages and pages, no paragraphs, no notes, and the Rosh Tevis and Kabbalah but with the years, so it was the first one that really made me aware that this is, don't be so scared. Just go slowly and you'll see some interesting things. Was Avraham Fried from Tzfas with the Pnina Levi Yitzchak. Geschmackes things. He started looking into it. See, oh yeah, I can see
vignettes of his Torah.
I still don't understand everything. Sometimes it's shtiklach, and Rav Dubov is making an excellent job with the Yalkut Levi Yitzchak, the opening up Pashit and explaining in the footnotes the deep concepts. But besides for all the Kabbalah, and Rebbe Levi Yitzchak was very much into the Sod, we see also that he demanded from the Rebbe in the correspondence that whenever the Rebbe would write to his father certain Chidushei Torah, again and again, Rebbe Levi Yitzchak would mention to him, you have to bring in more salt and pepper, tavlin and pilpulin. And he explains what he means. Be miyasid al pi Kabbalah more, so that it will be a full picture. It will be a fuller picture if you'll base it more on Kabbalah. So a lot of people are under the impression that all his Torah is Kabbalah. But that's not so. And there is also Nigla. There was a whole correspondence between the Rebbe's father and the Rebbe, where they had a fierce argument in Nigla of Torah.
In Talmudic aspects of the Torah.
Yeah. There, in that context.
About purity and impurity, if I remember correctly.
No, not that one. That's also, but Machshav of Truma and Kotchim and Kavanis.
The thought process of donating to the Beis HaMikdash, and what the thought accomplishes.
True, but to appreciate that, I'll mention another point. There's a famous story that Rebbe Levi Yitzchak went to get smicha from Reb Chaim Brisker. And while he was there, a shaila came up about the sukkah. The people in Eruv, in the courtyard, they forgot to make an Eruv. And Reb Chaim told Reb Levi Yitzchak, what do you say to how to deal with this problem? So he suggested, and Reb Chaim liked that very much, that the fact that they're eating in the same sukkah, that is me'arev. It makes them all join together and it's okay. Years later, Reb Gavriel Zinner, the Nite Gavriel, wrote to the Rebbe that he found this idea that the sukkah can be me'arev in the me'iri on Masechta Eruvin. So the Rebbe answered him. First, the Rebbe thanked him very much for this maramokim achi choshuv. But then the Rebbe writes to him, obviously you're aware that in Russia, they didn't have these Sfarim, and some of these Sfarim weren't even printed yet at the time. The Me'iri, indeed, was not yet in print. Was only years later did it was it published Bechlal. And that's besides for the point that many have the minhag to focus more on learning Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos, and maybe some more Sfarim and not more. But that was the point that the Rebbe made. Now here's an interesting thing. The Rebbe and the Rebbe's father argued about machshava in kachim, that if somebody decides this animal should be a korban, does the animal become holy just by thinking about it, or do you have to verbally designate it? So the Rebbe wrote to his father a question that in Likutei Torah, the Alter Rebbe says that it's that you have to say it bepeh, you have to be makdish bepeh, you have to verbally designate it. So the Rebbe asks his father, there's a Gemara that kol nediv leiv, that's just by deciding in the heart. So the Rebbe's father writes back to the Rebbe, I don't understand you. I'm wondering, how do you even ask such a question? It is a very simple concept that the fact that b'machshavah, in thought, you become obligated, that's only the obligation on the person that by deciding to do it, it obligates him to follow through, but not that the animal becomes kaddish. The animal is not yet holy until you verbally designate it. And that these are two separate concepts. So the Rebbe wrote back, we don't have the Rebbe's letter that he wrote to his father, but the Rebbe made notes on the letter that he got from his father, a whole bunch of sources in Shas and Poskim, where that's not so simple. And apparently he also wrote that back to his father because his father wrote back. And I see that you're not happy with my answer, he writes. The Terutzi is not good for you. And he again explains with further Marmakamis. And he writes, what you write from the Rambam, that it's obvious in the Rambam, what is obvious to you, for me, this is not obvious at all. And he argues, the Rebbe wrote back, holding his ground. And the Rebbe's father wrote back again. This is going back and forth, a fierce argument in halacha. We don't know where in the correspondence, it didn't go further, but we know that years later, the Rebbe was already here in America. The Rebbe wrote a Tshuva in Tshuva Siburim, an entire footnote, where the Rebbe again is writing his opinion very strongly, basing it, Rashi, Tosfos, Rambam, all the Rishonim. Now here's the interesting point. The Rebbe's view and his father's view is actually the Machlokes HaRishonim that only came to light also only now that we have the Meiri. The Meiri writes exactly what Rebbe Levi Yitzchak writes. The differentiation between the person's obligation versus the korban becoming kaddish, he writes it exactly like Rebbe Levi Yitzchak, not in the same words, but the concept, he writes it out that don't ask me that it says in the Gemara about machshav kol nediv leiv, because that's talking about the person's obligation and not about the holiness of the animal. So it comes out that the Rebbe was like expressing the views of Rashi and Tosfos the way the Rebbe learned Pshat, and his father actually was writing what he didn't have at the time, like the Rebbe writes to Rav Gavriel Zinner. It didn't exist yet, it wasn't around. It was in manuscripts, hidden away yet. But he had the same, learned the Gemaras exactly the way the Meiri learned it. That is a fascinating concept.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, the caliber of the Torah of the Rebbe and the Rebbe's Holy Father was certainly, I mean, for us it's tougher to grade these things. We're not, this is beyond our pay grade. But when you see it clearly in the Rishonim that this is what they were talking about, and there's clearly they didn't see, it's fascinating to see. Rabbi Mintz.
This idea of Achdus B'Torah that Rabbi David mentioned, we know it from Kimat every Sikha. How many Sikhas the Rebbe illustrates how a Rambam, a Halacha, Ashtek Gemara, Rashi can be best understood and sometimes only understood through the Yeinish Torah, through the Pnimis HaTorah. In general, we find that the idea of Machatz Divani Erpa, the Rebbe speaks like the Rashbi, that they were the pioneers
throughout generations that merged the two Torahs, the Nigla and Nister of Torah. Oftentimes, the Rebbe points, for example, to the Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek was Mishalev Nigla and Nister. But interestingly, I heard this from a Mashpia that the Tzemach Tzedek, indeed, you find oftentimes the intersection between the two, but there's a kesher. He illustrates a kesher between Nigla and Nister. Dafke in the Rebbe's Torah, we find not only a kesher between the two, but how the two are chativa achas, how the two are essentially misunderstood without the other element. Nigla the Torah can sometimes and oftentimes only be understood through Pnimis HaTorah. So this idea, we see it oftentimes in the Rebbe's Torah. Hamoin Sichis and Maimorim and Maimis and Setlach, we see this idea. But we can trace the origin of this Ichud in the Torah of Rebbe Levi Yitzchak. In a moedic way, we see it constantly. You mentioned the Rishima, that they arrived just before, I believe it's 55 years, Chof of Tafshin Chavhei, with the Rishim Anil Yitzchak ben Zalderachel arrived. They came together with a few Ksavim with Alter Rebbe. There was a Bashgacha Pratis that arrived just before Chava. That I mentioned in Farbrengen before Chava, and once again. And in that Sikha, the Rebbe said, at the end of the Farbrengen Chava of Tafshin Chavhei, that we see here the concept of Yadul Torah v'Yader, in a way that Torah, in the Torah of his father, is mamish, is unified as one. And the Rebbe says, for example, every Rav, Mechabrim, Rabbonim who wrote, when a concept comes up in Torah, they see on their Shafa, Sforim and Nista the Torah, they have before them Ma'im ideas, and they're able to connect the two. But the Rebbe points out that much of the Ksavim that we have from Rebbe Levi Yitzchak was without any Sforim. And it wasn't that he saw a pshat in a sefer in the morning.
He didn't have Google. He didn't have
access. He didn't have access to any
no
Sforim.
Search engine.
And Sapshat, he saw something in the morning, and later that day he saw something. It was, and here you see that it was part of the etzem uhus, the ishuto, the personality, the derech halimud, the way of Rebbe Levi Yitzchak was that at the core was ichud nigla and nister. And this is an idea that we find throughout in the Rebbe's Torah. There's a famous sichim called the Chel Kafal Va'era. The Rebbe speaks to this, that the ichud of nigla Torah, where the Rebbe quotes ein, that oftentimes in nigla we find that ein ho inyan benigla oimer ela dasheni beprimis haTorah. Oftentimes in Yonim nigla cannot be understood, and the Rebbe mentions of there in that sich in Ha'ara that this is the distinction between Re'iyah and Shmiya. Shmiya, we hear something, we hear one element, and then Shmiya, the idea of hearing. We hear one concept in Nigla, and later we hear another concept, the same idea as it's expressed in the inner dimensions of Torah, Primis HaTorah, and we connect the two. Re'iyah, on the other hand, when we see something that's visual, we're able to see a composite of both simultaneously. We could see it b'chod machta, b'vas achas, at once. And the Rebbe says this. We find this in the Torah of Rebbe Levi Yitzchak, and we know that this closing of the gap between Nigla and Nister is something that the Rebbe took much further, not only in areas of Torah, but in all areas of our life. We see this also in the Torah of Rebbe Levi Yitzchak. The Rebbe, for example, once sent, I believe it was before Pesach, you mentioned, the Rebbe sent a pair of shoes to his father, and he receives a letter back from the Rebbe's father. He receives a letter back describing al pi nigla, al pi nister, the concept of na'alayim. The Rebbe once described in a letter that he moved into a new apartment that had two rooms in the apartment. Shtei chadarim. There was a reply back. Al pi nister, the idea of two. So everything that Rebbe Levi saw, he didn't just see it the way it's on the surface.
But about the na'alayim, after writing that whole piece, Hidrich ban Olive, at the end he concludes, Heim Toiv. They're good. They fit.
So here we see this idea was something that Yesoidosoi, Baharei Kodesh, the Ichud of Nigla Nister and the Ichud of Kol Chelkei Ha'olam is mevusis and meyusid very much on the Torah of Rebbe Levi Yitzchak. And finally, the end of that Sikha, Chel Kafal, the Rebbe concludes that through seeing Torah, the Oifen Shal Re'iyah, as one, we bring closer, we hasten the Bias HaMashiach, which the idea of Mashiach is also a Yechida, which is Ma'achet Kol Yisrael in Oifen of Riyah, the Nigla Kvoid Hashem V'ro Kol Basa Yachdav. So when we
part of our soul.
it connects. The limud is mekarev b'yis Mashiach, when this will be revealed, when we will all look at a pair of shoes and see it through the lens of Rebbe Yitzchak. Ayimos Mashiach. Chaim l'chaim.
Chaim, thank you. You know, I think another piece of the Rebbe's Torah, which we see clearly is rooted in the Rebbe's Holy Father's Torah, is the significance of every point. Sometimes when I have an opportunity to share some of the Torah, and people say, like, that's not a question, that's not. Well, why is that important? Why would that's not even that's not even in the running. But we see that the Rebbe's father in his Torah shows that each and every detail is significant. Every letter, there's no such thing as a side detail. Maybe Rabbi Taub will address that idea.
So, first of all, when we're talking about scholarship, we're talking about scholars in general. You know, there are people who are very smart and very learned, and then there are holy people. The Rebbe's father clearly was a scholar. I mean, even people like us can make that evaluation. But what we get a glimpse of is something far beyond scholarship. It's one thing to be able to take every detail in a piece of Torah and to expound upon the significance of every seemingly insignificant detail, which Rebbe's father very clearly did in thousands of instances. That's one thing. But what strikes me, at least for me personally, made such an impression, and I have to thank Rabbi Duba for making this possible, the way you opened up that Rishima, that note that the Rebbe's father wrote at the darkest time in his life, and at a time where a regular person would not be able to go on. And the Rebbe's father is writing about every detail of the persecution and the imprisonment and the trial, and finding meaning in it all. So it's like, it's one thing to sit in a yeshiva and to delve into the text and find one detail and another detail and another as a scholar. But to see life this way, and to see life this way at the most challenging moments, that's a whole other level, just a whole other level.
אנו נמצאים כאן בעיר ניקולאייב, אוקראינה, עיר הולדתו של הרבי, בבית הארכיון הממשלתי של העיר. אנו רואים את המסמך המקורי של רישום הנישואין של הרבנית חנה לבעלה הגדול רב לוי יצחק. כמו כן, אנחנו רואים פה את רישומי הלידה המקוריים של שלושת בניהם. זוהי תעודת הלידה של הרבי, בנם בכורם. זוהי תעודת הלידה של רבי ישראל אריה לייב, וזוהי תעודת הלידה של אחיהם רב דויברג. אנו נמצאים כאן כעת על יד ביתו של רב העיר, הרב מאיר שלמה ינובסקי, עליו השלום. בבית זה התגוררו חמיו וחמותו של בעל ההילולה, הרב מאיר שלמה עליו השלום, והרבנית רחל השם ימקום דומה ינובסקי. מדי שנה היה הרבי אומר קדיש לעילוי נשמתה של הסבתא, שנרצחה בידי הנאצים יימח שמם בכ"ד תשרי תש"ב. דבר נפלא התגלה לפני 30 שנה בדיוק. בכ"ד תשרי תש"ן, בעת הגעה של שיחת קודש מיוחדת שהרבי הקדיש לרגל היורצייט שלה, הרבי הוסיף רישום בכתב יד קודשו, בה חשף היורצייט דהימי זקנתי רחל השם ימקום דומה, אשת אבי זקני הרב הגאון וכולו וכולו ינובסקי ניקולאייב. כמה שבועות בסיום חודשי הקיץ, כמה שנים הייתי בניקולאייב וטיפלה בי וכולו. ועל שנים בהם המשפחה כבר התגוררה בעיר יקטרינוסלב, והרבי הגיע לשהות בביתם של הסבא והסבתא בחודשי הקיץ. בשנת תרס"ה, כאשר הרבי היה בגיל 3, התעורר גל של פוגרומים ברחבי רוסיה ואוקראינה, שהתמקד בעיקר בקהילות היהודיות. גם בעיר זו התארגנו הבריונים האנטישמיים להפליא את מכותיהם ביהודי העיר. גם משפחת שניאורסון נמלטה מביתה והגיעה למקום המסתור של המשפחות היהודיות. מנהרה צרה מתחת למרתף של בית מרקחת, כמה קומות מתחת לפני הקרקע עד יבור זעם. אנו עומדים כעת ממש במקום בו התחבא הרבי יחד עם הוריו באותה תקופה. ברשימת זיכרונותיה מספרת הרבנית חנה שבאחד הימים החלו ילדים שהיו מבוהלים מאוד לבכות מרוב פחד, והיה חשש גדול שהבכי יסגיר את מקום המחבוא, וזה הכניס את כולם בסכנה גדולה. אימה ופחד נפלו על כולם. חוסר האונים, כותבת הרבנית, היה גדול מאוד. לפתע, כותבת הרבנית, נמצא ילד אחד רגוע, קטן. זה היה בני מנחם מנדל בן 3. בתושייה של אדם גדול, הוא החל לעבור בין הילדים הקטנים ולהרגיע אותם. כאשר הוא עובר מאחד לאחד, לוחש דבר מה על האוזן, מניק משהו קטן, והפלא ופלא, הילד הקטן הזה הצליח להחזיר את השקט למקום המסתור. בזכות זה ניצלו חייהם של כל אלה שהתחבאו במרתף הסתרים הזה.
אנחנו עומדים עכשיו ברחוב מירונובה, מספר 9. על הרחוב הזה הרבי אומר, דורט נידו הגס ווס גיהר צומיר. יש שם רחוב ששייך אליי.
Храб Каменецкий дорог не купил.
Храб, могу исправить. Ты говорите по-русски уже? Каменецкий?
Каменецкий. Das ist hier Mutter, Mrs. Lipski, fährt zusammen mit ihr.
Ich hätte die Katzinislav. Weil ich Katzinislav dort Hamol Gildat, da Gas was gehört zu mir. Kein Sache was los. Bitte schuldig.
פה כל החיים התנהלו. הרבי גר פה ממול ברחוב מירונובה 20, והרבי כותב שהוא זוכר שהם היו חוצים את הכביש קצת לשמאל ובאים לבית כנסת שזה רחוב מירונובה 9, כאן הבית כנסת של רב לייביק. מפה התנהלו כל החיים היהודיים של העיר, כל השיעורים בקבלה שהוא נתן ליהודי העיר, כל מה שאנחנו שומעים על דניפרופטרובסק, יקטרינוסלב, הכל התנהל מפה. זה בית כנסת שניתן במתנה לרב העיר רב לייביק, מיהודי בשם פלי, שהעניק את זה במתנה לרב לייביק. ופה אנחנו רואים את השלט. בבית הכנסת הזה התפללו במשך שנים רבות הרב הקדוש רב לוי יצחק שניאורסון ובנו הרבה. תוך 50 בתי כנסת שנלקחו מהיהודים, כולל גם את הבית כנסת של רב לייביק ברחוב מירונובה 9, השאירו בית כנסת אחד פתוח, בית כנסת לא גדול, ופה הם שלטו בכל הבא וכל היוצא, ופה התפלל רב לייביק במשך 4 שנים, מתוף ריש צדיק ה' עד תוף ריש צדיק טס, ועכשיו ניכנס בפנים לראות את הבית כנסת כפי שהוא היה. הפנים של הבית כנסת נשאר עדיין עד היום. אנחנו נמצאים עכשיו בתוך בית הכנסת, איפה שרב לייביק התפלל במשך 4 שנים, מתוף ריש צדיק ה' עד תוף ריש צדיק טס, השנים הכי קשות, כשכבר התחילו הלחצים והאיסורים והרדיפות. כשהגענו לפה בתוף שינון, באנו לבית כנסת הזה, היו פה כמה זקנים מופלגים שזכרו את רב לייביק מהתפילות שהם התפללו איתו בשנים ההם.
חוקרים גילו לאחרונה שהבית הזה שנמצא כאן מאחוריי, זה הבית שהוא נשאר על תילו בדיוק באותו צורה כפי שהוא נראה עכשיו. זה הבית שבעצם גרו רב לייביק והרב סנחנה
והמשפחה גרו בבית הזה. כאן בעצם התקיימה הבר מצווה בי"א ניסן, לאחר שהחגיגה הייתה בבית הכנסת, המשיכו כולם לכאן, והחגיגה המשיכה מ-12 בצהריים ועד מוצאי שבת, המשיכה חגיגה, וגם הסבא הגיע מלובביץ' במיוחד לבר מצווה, והוא הביא את ברכתו של הרבי ירש"ב.
פה אנחנו רואים את הבית של רב לייביק, רב צמחן, ואנחנו רואים את השלט, כתוב פה בבית הזה, התגורר כבוד קדושת הגאון המקובל רבי לוי יצחק שניירסון, זכר צדיק לברוכה, רבה הראשי של יקטרינסלב, דנייפרופוטרובסק, בין השנים תרס"ט, תרצ"ט, ומהמקום הזה, בתרצ"ט, בטס ניסן, ב3 לפנות בוקר, הגיעו 4 חוקרים מהNKVD, כפי שמתארת הרבנית חנה בזכרינס שלה, את כל מה שקרה פה במקום הזה, ומפה הם לקחו אותו לבית סוהר, במרתפים האיומים של בניין הקג"ב שנמצא 5 דקות נסיעה מפה.
הישר מהבית שראינו זה עתה ברחוב בריקדנו, הוא נלקח לכאן למקום הזה שעומד מאחוריי, הוא נלקח לכאן בט' ניסן, תרצ"ט, באמצע הלילה, הוא נלקח לכאן לחקירות, ישב פה כמה זמן, ומכאן נלקח לעוד חקירות שהיו גם פה בעיר וגם בקייב, עד שהוא חזר לפה, עד שהוא נשלח לגלות בצ'יאלי, וזה היה בשנת תש. אי אפשר לתאר את הכאב לב ואת העוגמת נפש ואת הצער והכאב הגדול שהיה למשפחת בית הרב באותו זמן. אנחנו בעזרת השם גם נוכל ללכת ולראות את המקום עצמו, איפה שהחזיק אותו, שהוא לא השתנה והוא נשאר בדיוק אותו דבר, על פי העדויות שיש.
אנחנו נכנסים לתוך התא, בו ישב הרב לוי יצחק, מזמן המאסר שלו. במהלך המאסר תחקרו אותו פה ושלחו אותו לקייב. מקייב שלחו אותו בחזרה לדנפר, והכל היה תוך 1.5 שנה, עד שפסקו גירוש למקום נידח בקזחסטן, כפר בשם צ'ילי, שבו אין שום יהודים, היה אסור לו ליצור קשר עם שום יהודים, ושם הוא היה עד שנת 1943, עד תש"ג. ומאז הרשו לו להתיישב ולגור בעיר הבירה של קזחסטן, אלמטי. ושם הוא נפטר בשנת 1944, תש"ד.
Und wie sie Tage danach gewähnt, der Fall ist also gewähnt bei Beisa Asuri, wo dort sind die gewähnt die Möglichkeit auf Leben in Teir und mit keinem sein Mitzvahs, wie sie darf zu sein. Und man hat so gewusst, dass was sich missassig sein, für Kashrus, wie schlimm, wie Tehidur, bei Negei, zu Kimche, de Pische, wie Kajetse, is Olu, und weil Adra bederach Hateva das gedacht bringen zu einem Meister und dann noch der weiter die Kinyonim und wie sie Tage gewähnt bepeil, aber so dann noch gestärkt bei einer Gehe zu Limo die Matzmei, Kiem Amitzvit Baatzmei, wo sie geworden am Matze, was eines Tage Rachmone Pater, aber der Reit der Linien fällt, und auf all Piken hat sich der Baba Hahilula nicht vorgestellt und hat es getan mit dem ganzen Sturm.
To bring us into the mood of this beautiful Niggun, please enjoy the beautiful violin playing of Stanislav Reb Michal Zlochever's Niggun.
Oh geschickt in Tofshin in Beis Elo Kisviyad von Rebbe von Hayat von Mashab von Vater Rebbe's Vater Chidush Levi Yitzchak Al-Gittin hat gedruckt von dem. Ich habe es geschickt von Erzisrael, ich habe es gefunden.
Jeder geschrieben, ja, ich habe gewisse Jahre verkehrt.
Ich handle mit den alten Sachen. Ich habe es gefunden mit der Pelle. Gnise.
Das sind nicht genau die Sachen, dass er nicht Kachadosh, sondern Chadosh im Mann.
Das gedruckt, das Levi Yitzchak Al-Gittin.
Ja, dort sind wir von so schön gelernt. Wir lernen das weiter, weil die Gott hat sehr viel Liebe, was lernen wir noch stellen. Wir sagen Archova Mamash. Wir sagen Psuri-Stelle. Atzloch in der Archova Nyonim. Amen.
Das ist gut für mein Schwager.
Wir sagen Psuri-Stelle.
Ich bin ja gewöhnt mit euren Eltern, ich habe geredet mit euren Taten, mit eurer Mama, auch schon PLP. Aber viele hat mir gegeben, am Matze, auf dem ersten Kosais, ist es Pesach. Und er gedacht, weg von Almat, habe ich ein Ballit im Waggon, gekommen nach Plemenitze, Fin Alma Ata in Sizilien. Im Gewinn verschieben sie a Chodosh im Fine für ihn.
Ja, das war ein guter Besuch, ein größten Dank für ein Gruß. Das war ein guter Besuch, haben lange gesunde Jahre. Fröhliche Jahre.
I remember meeting that Jew in 1990 in Topshin Nun in Minsk. His name was Kaplan. I remember meeting him and we said we must bring him to the Rebbe to give this was a live regards. And he said he was 5 months with the Rebbe's father. You see how much how the Rebbe appreciated it. L'chaim, l'chaim.
I remember when he came. That was like a year later. Tafshin Aleph. I remember seeing him around 770. But
so we see that the Rebbe here the Rebbe told the gentleman that found the manuscript of the Rebbe's father's Torah and Gittin. It was published, I believe, in Topshim and Hay. They had come to the Rebbe years later saying that they're the ones who sent it in. But the Rebbe said that thousands have already learned it and many more will learn it. And there's, as of late, more and more are joining this idea of learning this Torah. And we have the Yalkut Levi Yitzchak ala Torah. And we also have we find something very, very interesting that in 1990, the same in Topshin Nun, that was the first time that the Rebbe actually allowed his name to be used for the name of a sefer in relation to printing Torah of his father. Like Rebbe Duba mentioned earlier, maybe you'll talk about it, how the Rebbe really learned a piece of his father's Torah by every Farbrengen. Would you like to share some of how that worked and talk a little bit about the name of that sefer the Rebbe allowed, Toras Menachem Tiferes Levi Yitzchak, which we just actually had the final 2 volumes were printed with some more pieces that the Rebbe had originally not given to print in the earlier volumes when he gave his letters. We see the Rebbe wanted to share. Those letters were the most dear thing the Rebbe had in terms of his possessions, and he shared it with us because of the Torah content. But the praises that his father gave him, he said, you don't have to share that, but now they've been shared too. So Rabbi Duval.
So as I mentioned earlier, again, this is like a Rebbe thing. No one asks questions. We don't understand exactly why. But when it came to the 25th Yahrtzeit, the Rebbe started to print the manuscripts and the writings of his father, Rebbe Levi Yitzchak. And then, that time, as soon as it started to come out, the Rebbe would, every Shabbos, Farbrengens, he would expound on his father's, what's called Ha'oris, his footnotes. We have the famous thing that I remember I once heard from the Pesach, who kocht sich in them. He really spoke about great enthusiasm, that it's mind-boggling, but the Rebbe took those years, Topshin Chovah, 69, 70, 71, and it's the only thing that we have in a complete fashion. The Rebbe took all his father's footnotes on the Yahrtzeit Chovah, and he explained each one of them in great detail. And if you put it together, the Rebbe's explanation on his father, it's like a new Yahrtzeit Chovah that it's like it opened up like a different world. As once he finished the Tanya, then as years went on, we used to see the Rebbe used to come down by Farbrengen. He would come down with a chumash. He would come down with his father's sefer, and would sit.
The Rebbe would bring it down.
Sure.
In my years, it was already unique. He would put it on the table before Farbrengen. So this is very interesting. I never knew that the Rebbe himself used to bring it down.
Maybe I'm wrong.
Later on, it was set up.
But every Shabbos, now by Chassidim saw an interesting thing, that the Rashi Sichos started in Topshin Chovah in 1965 after Rebbe Sechana passed away, Vov Tishrei, and that already Shabbos Noyach, the Rebbe started to launch the Rashi Sichos. And from then on, you see an interesting thing. Every single Shabbos, he honored his parents. There was a Rashi Sichos in honor of his mother, and there was the Biyurim, the explanations on the Zoya, that was for his father. Later on, the Rebbe used to always also talk about the Rambam, which is like his own personal thing. But this was every Shabbos guaranteed. So this just shows that he wanted all of us to include in the learning of his father. And many sichos, in the Kuta sichos, you will see the Rebbe was Magia, beautiful biurim from all those fabulous sichos.
I remember 40 years ago at the Farbrengen of Chof in Tafshin Mem, the Rebbe established the Koil Tferes Keinim Levi Yitzchak. He named the learning with seniors after his father as one of the projects. And that was something that we've heard from people who were with the Rebbe's father in not only in his city where he was the Rav, but later on when he was in Kazakhstan in exile, he also organized groups to study with people, both children's groups and groups of whoever was there, including elderly Jews who were there because they were running from the war or whatever it was. And here the Rebbe made that project. The Rebbe also established a fund in the name of his father.
You mentioned this. I will share with you a new answer that just we all just saw it recently when there was the first gathering for the elderly. And if you remember, these were all like Russians, from Brighton Beach, men, elderly men, women, and more wonderful people, but more on the simplistic side. And they wrote in the schedule of what's going to be was a whole hour before the Rebbe had mincha with them. The first time they had a gathering with the Rebbe for the elderly Tferes Keinim Levi Yitzchak. When they wrote in the schedule, the only thing that the Rebbe commented, it's printed over here. So they wrote that there's going to be an opening words, and it'll be like for 50 minutes. The Rebbe added these words. What should be the opening words? B'dvar Malchus, words of royalty. Mitoyrosei shel, and then he circles Levi Yitzchak, from the Torah from my father. That should be the Dvar Malchus. And then he wrote, Hamuvon lahane esofim, which should be understood to these who are gathered. That means bring it down in simple terms. But you see from this answer that the Rebbe wanted that his Torah should be spread, his father's Torah, to every single level of Jews, not only to the scholars, these who are in yeshiva, goinim, as you mentioned before, even simplistic people. And there are beautiful things that you said before Pesach. The Rebbe's father wrote, it's a big mistake. These who think it's true, he was a Makubal and he wrote Kabbalah, but there's so much there in Pshat, in Remez, in Drush, and in Soit. All levels that everyone, you could find something that he spoke to everyone.
In the Mamorim of the Rebbe, the discourses, which is certainly the most profound, deepest, like even people of our caliber see that, how the Rebbe delivered a mimer, how it was with a song before, and people stood, and the Rebbe closed his eyes, and he held a handkerchief, or whatever. The mimer is certainly the pinnacle of the Rebbe's Torah that we could see. So on certain occasions, the Rebbe mentioned Torah clearly and specifically from all the Rabbeim. And in the later years, we see also he mentioned also Torah from his father within the Mamorim, and that's how it's printed. But as I'm learning a little bit more, as time goes on, we study a little bit more of the Rebbe's father, I see the Rebbe implicitly mentions his father's Torah in all of the Mamorim, even earlier, when it's not clear, and then he doesn't mention it in the name of his father. It's clearly already, the Rebbe's Mamorim are replete with Chassidus of his father, of these concepts, and especially those Mamorim of Yud Shvat, when the Rebbe mentioned all the Rabbeim the other times. Did you want to add something, Rabbi Shmurli?
About what you just mentioned, that Lahak was preparing now because of the Corona crisis. It wasn't printed. And also, Chaim Shol was in the hospital, so they print Maimorim for Yomim Tovim, so a volume of Maimorim for Chag HaShavuos, but it didn't get printed for this past Chag HaShavuos. But I was looking over the Maimorim, and there was one concept that was mentioned in a Maimor, but there was no footnote. Where does that come from? I remembered that in Likutei Levi Yitzchak, the Rebbe's father writes that Rosh Hashanah is something, I don't recall right now what it was about. And so I told him to add on the Ma'amakim. It's the Rebbe's father's Torah. That's exactly what you just mentioned. That there is a word from Rebbe Levi Yitzchak. The Rebbe didn't say that it's from the Rebbe's father. Talking about the Rebbe's, the Ktoim, the pieces from the letters that the Rebbe's father wrote to the Rebbe, praising the Rebbe, that were printed now for the first time. There's a lot of fascinating things over there. But one very
Rebbe's
fascinating
humility, and that
so
you're raised.
that's exactly that. The Rebbe's father writes that what you're writing about your Divrei Torah, she'ein b'hem chidush, that there's nothing novel in there. I disagree with you. And im kotin ato beinecha, if you are harei roish v'chulu. Now, this is a quote from a pasuk. There's a pasuk in Shmuel where it says, im kotin ato beinecha, if you hold yourself humble, if the Yisrael ata, ve'im shochacho Hashem lekecha melech, Hashem anointed you as king. Now, the Rebbe's father does not conclude this whole pasuk, but it just begins that pasuk, and it's an allusion to that concept that, know who you are. And this is a very interesting thing, because we know that Rebbe Levi Yitzchak is a direct descendant